Welcome to the State of Cybersecurity Industry panel series. We are proud to bring together decades of cybersecurity experience from world-class experts, executives, and strategic advisors. We will explore the present and future of cybersecurity evolution, talk about compliance and regulation, best practices, emerging threats, and the impact on the IoT and OT device market.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I'm Evgeny Karam. I will be the moderator in the first State of Cybersecurity Industry panel brought to you by Cybits. Joining us today, cybersecurity influencer and Forbes writer, Chuck Brooks.
Thank you, Evgeny. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you to Cybits too.
Innovative creator of digital bill of material and one of the first commercial firewall products, Chris Blask.
Thanks, Evgeny. Nice to be here.
Cybits co-founder and CTO, Dmitry Reidman.
Thanks, Evgeny. Happy to hear.
Today, we are going to discuss relevant cybersecurity topics addressed by United States President Joe Biden in executive order on improving the nation's cybersecurity. We have planned 6 topics for today, and then we'll hear questions from the audience. This is a live event, so please use YouTube chat to ask your questions. Before we begin, on May 12, 2021, only several days after the Colonial Pipeline attack, the US government announced an executive order designed to strengthen government cybersecurity defenses in the wake of several major recent hacks, which impacted numerous federal agencies and private companies. There were several key elements, such as multi-factor authentication, software transparency, protection of IoT devices, EDR, vulnerability management, and disclosure of breaches. So let's begin. In your opinion, what motivated the government to create executive order?
Well, I think there are a variety of factors. And first, I want to say that, cybersecurity is unusual because it really has strong bipartisan support. It's not really a political issue in the sense of other issues. So the agenda already was being set by past administrations in building on what they need to do. And it started earlier with supply chain orders and other executive orders that called attention to the targeting of all these breaches. But I think what motivated this administration was really 2 breaches, big breaches, SolarWinds, primarily a supply chain breach and a lot of lateral problems inside the systems still going on. And then what you mentioned earlier, the Colonial Pipeline, where it took down a good percentage of the East Coast oil supply. And I think we have to realize that this was in the works, and this executive order really changes the paradigm from reactive to preventive, and that's really important. And the aspects you mentioned are really integral to it, and I think it really is a down payment on our cybersecurity for the future.
Chris, Dmitry?
I agree. As Chuck says, this lines up across multiple administrations. This is not a one-off. It's not a fad. This is a long-term trend. It goes to things that Chuck and I and others have been working on for decades now. We have a need to be able to see what's inside things.
Now, there is no way it was created in a few days about Colonial Pipeline. There's like 18 pages of the document. So it probably was in the works. I'm guessing, and it was mentioned before as well on the internet, it's probably started in November last year. What do you guys think?
Well, I think personally it's been in the works, collaborative. A lot of the same people that are in this administration are the same people who are in the previous administrations, particularly in the Department of Homeland Security apparatus. And there's a lot of outside influences like the Cyberspace Solarium and others have made these suggestions. And these suggestions have been around. And I think they're looking for, basically a framework to implement them. There's a lot of pronouncements that have happened in the past, but, and that's why I said the Colonial Pipeline thing was just, this is, enough is enough. We really need to push it to the front. So I think, it's not that it's new, but it was pushed forward by that incident.
There's a lot of milestones in the executive order, and a lot of them mention 60 days, 90 days. There's also mention of SBOM, and I know, Chris, you've been working on SBOM for quite a long time. So the government gave NTIA 60 days to figure out what is the minimum SBOM level, I guess, should be. Can you elaborate more? What do you think it's mean? How it's possible, even and realistic to have?
Sure, and it is. Multiple call-outs in this. So Kate Stewart has been running the SPDX project at the Linux Foundation for 10 years now. Alan Friedman at NTIA in the Department of Commerce, as you mentioned, has been doing a great job for about 3 years now, herding this group of us cats. And there's enough of a workable understanding in that group of what this, what needs to be in an SBOM. Alan and the other folks are taking the input of the community. As we all like to criticize ourselves and our nation, our government, our corporations, and whatnot. But this is an example of the working groups and cooperation that come when it's time to get things done. As you say, enough is enough. In the last year and a half, we've had Colonial Pipeline, the Suez Canal, a pandemic, any number of other reasons to look closely at this. And while the details of this executive order or any executive order are important and worth looking at, particularly if they impact you directly, if you're looking at the long change, the fact that this executive order and the one from February 24th and several from the last administration, two very different administrations, really follow the same path. We will provide visibility in the SBOM case into, for example, what code is running inside of the things that control the grid and our hospitals and so forth. And we're now at this point where the forcing function of an SBOM with, as you say, a 60-day limit, will force the working groups to enunciate exactly what they mean. And through the rest of this year and next year, we'll try those things out, and where we're wrong, they'll evolve. But this is driving the evolution.
Yeah. So basically, I think if we start in May 12, we only have a couple of weeks left for the NTIA to do this. I hope it's a realistic milestone. Was it going to be an extension? Was going to be a version 1 of I guess, the document? Can you maybe talk about this? What do you think will happen?
Well, I think you're right. I expect a version 1. And anyone familiar with any sort of long process like this, that's what you expect. I think so software bill of materials. Let's talk about the content here for a second. A software bill of materials is a document that says inside my software there is this stuff, right? And all software contains other software and links and libraries and open source. So that's what we need. We need that document. Now,
how can I prove it? How can I prove it? I can write anything I want.
And as you break this down, you take SBOM and DBOM. So DBOM is an attestation ecosystem. And anyone can stand up a node, they can involve themselves in channels, and they can agree to deal with other people or not. And we find a lot of this is what we do already. Companies buy and sell from each other, and they promise things and they tell each other things all the time. Now, where organizations decide to be honest or dishonest, that works out for them better or worse over time. So, if you have a trust relationship with a source, and as Cybeats folks know, there are ways to take a binary, for example, and look at it and say, I think this is the software inside it. If that doesn't match what an SBOM from a vendor tells you, then perhaps there's a difference. And perhaps they're missing something. So we'll all work through it.
So we will have companies and products that will help validate what do you write in SBOM. So I'm wondering how it will change the products and the way people design IoT devices in the next 12 to 18 months.
Yeah.
That's a great question, again, and I'll take it. So I think that first and foremost, where we'll see the changes is in the procurement levels and procurement contracts, right? And they will probably require greater transparency from their supply chain. And whenever it comes to devices or software or anything else that's been procured by especially government-related bodies, right? And the level of the transparency, that's kind of what this SBOM requirements are, right? Because ASBO might be many things and can have many different meanings to many different people. So, from one side, ASBOM can be the sources that your application or your device is built from, right? On the other hand, that might be the binary that I'm actually selling. So you as end user, as a downstream consumer of that specific software, you want to know that whatever was used to build the software is authentic, right? And the software that is built and you got it is authentic. And then when you operating the software and deploying it, you also want to come back and recheck the software that's running either on your servers, or if it's larger systems, you want to make sure that whatever you have in your facilities connected to your network, it's still the same thing that you got from the beginning with. And one of the issues that we have seen, and I think that was one of the great motivation behind this executive order, is actually the software supply chain that we have seen related to SolarWinds. And if you're looking at any organization that building a software product today, there are multiple points that can be attacked, and usually they are not being protected as well as the rest of the organization. So one of these locations is actually the source itself, right? And you can either take over the developer workstation and push some malicious source on his behalf without him noticing and knowing. And if you don't have the proper gates and checks in your process to stop that or review such pushes of code, you actually getting malicious code being pushed and been thought as a part of the product. Then attacker can compromise the source control. He can compromise the build platform that builds it, right? And then just replace the software that's been built with his malicious piece of the software that does whatever the software is supposed to do, but there is some little extra that's been added, and that's kind of the malicious code that can do can wreak havoc on systems. And then of course there's the packaging, right? When it's been packaged and been shared with the end users. When you're getting a source, actually when you're getting a software today, you're downloading it from somewhere, from a server, or it's been sent to you by email or by other means. But how you actually checking that whatever you're downloading is exactly what you're expecting it to be, right? There is of course different type of methods, and that's exactly what ASBOM approach helps to overcome. The other thing that we are seeing is that there will be some disruption in the market from perspective of licensing and open source software. Now, once we asking a greater transparency about the ingredients of the software that we're getting, we actually also will get inherently information about open sources, and in some cases companies concerned to share that because they don't have a good hygiene for open source libraries that they have used, right? So now suddenly if they expose this information, they could be in trouble of infringing some type of open source licenses. And if someone doesn't have proper governance internally in the organization, they will have to close the gaps very quickly, and in some cases undergo very large redesigns of their products or solutions. Vulnerability management also is something like which is will have to change as well. But I can speak a lot about this topic.
Chris, so, I see you want to add something here.
I think that Chris wants.
Right. He, Dmitry said it right at the beginning: policy and contract language. Right. If you're my customer and you say thou shalt, give me an SBOM, I have to decide if I want to keep you as a customer, and that's going to be more and more the case. And these issues of intellectual property control, there's a number of proof of concepts being developed in a number of areas, totally different sectors, all at the same time. Again, showing that this is the time to work through these things. And what we'll see, look out for this one as this year and next year go forward. It's less about whether you have an SBOM or not. It's more about the contract language saying that you will agree to provide me the contents, the SBOM, perhaps not even now, but under these conditions. If there's a vulnerability comes out from a reputable source, that could be related to your software, you will share your SBOM with me or part of your SBOM all the way back up the supply chain. So that contract language, literally just English text, better yet, smart contract language text, with oracles reading it in channels, will automate the sharing of this information and the control of the intellectual property. And we'll find, looking back, that we never had any control of IP at all. And through these mechanisms that develop over the next several years, we'll be able to see who we're sharing our IP with, what parts of it, and whether or not they even look at it. That'll be new.
Yeah. I think great points. And I think to add to it, I actually all the technical aspects that were just covered, but the real thematic change, I think, in this executive order is it's using the power of federal procurement to dictate how the market is going to be shaped. So they're exactly right in saying that you're going to have to work within the rules, and you're going to have to do security by design up front, and you're going to have to meet these milestones. So it's a paradigm shift, and it's a little bit different from what typically has been done at the Department of Homeland Security and other agencies, where they have a public-private cooperation and they take best practices from the private sector. This is really telling the private sector is that, okay, if you want to be part of our customer base, you're going to have to adhere to these goals and follow them closely. And I think if you look at some of the other aspects that are happening with the DoD and CMMC requiring stronger cyber hygiene and other elements of overview of cybersecurity process here, you're going to see that there's a pattern happening here, and this executive order is really pushing that home.
So right now, the executive order talking about the government, everybody dealing with the government need to provide this information. If they need to provide this information, they may need to spend more money and time to actually create it. Would it make the products more expensive?
I doubt it. At the end of the day, I think that this has been discussed at great length. All these topics have been, right? What Chuck just said sounds to me like conversations we've all been having for decades. At some point, this reaches a level of seriousness that if we, the community, cybersecurity folks, whomever, haven't fixed it, someone's going to make us. And you're exactly right. This is exactly what in the U.S. a federal public-private system is for. When the public sector, represented by all of us, at the end of the day, say, if you really want to sell into the systems that keep me alive, you're going to have to XYZ. So now it's contents of software. Now it's software bill of materials. Perfect. And like so many things, there are smart people behind this, layers and layers deep. An EO like this would not be coming out if it were impossible to deliver. Now, I think it's going to be challenging to deliver. I expect to see some interesting moments, where maybe there's an industry pushback and saying, we're not always giving you our software bill of materials. But that's, as I said a moment ago, say, all right. But if there is, what are the conditions under which you will share IP?
Would this make the software better?
Right. That was mine, I think, or who's?
Yes.
Yeah. Right. Yes. At the end of the day, right? Because, whenever we're building things, whether it's software or anything else, I'm a big fan of applied innovation. I usually don't know what I'm doing. I'm just doing it and we'll see what happens. Right. And that's how most things are built. That's very innovative and so forth. And that's how, we've gotten this far with software to date. But, and that's not going away. There's lots of room for innovation in code and always will be. But there's levels of seriousness of anything. This is not a backyard project anymore. This is literally aircraft carriers and national grids and. Paul F. Roberts did a great story just in Forbes yesterday, I think, on the agriculture sector. We have to have better quality of software. As it turns out, all of these systems, having software bill of materials, sharing attestations and so forth, will make us have better visibility of what it is we're doing. And that they'll lend themselves better to better engineering processes and real engineering, not the upstart, cyber engineering, but the kind of engineering that's been building bridges and water systems for thousands of years. This will make things better.
Do you think the idea that people need to disclose what's inside the ingredients, they will have just because of this to write a better code and write better software because people will know what they're doing?
Yeah, by itself, yes. And of course, this is happening in a larger field of having better visibility. Do you know what's going on? Do you know what you put inside this thing? And again, it's not so much about even providing the software bill of materials; it's about knowing that you have to. Whether
Chuck,
or not
what do
you
you think?
publish it right away, someone may knock on the door and say, "Do you know what's inside this?" And if you don't, you better clean house inside.
Yeah. Chuck, what do you think?
No, I wholeheartedly agree to this. I mean, you have to be more thorough in your preparation and your coding, and generally there's always flaws with malware and all kinds of things involved when you're building applications. So that alone is going to reduce the cyber threats, because a lot of these attackers are just taking advantage of things that are already in code already. So I think this will be good. And you're looking at also, that you mentioned the fact that, will the prices go up? I don't think so. I think it's going to get more competitive, because the market for government is huge. And it's not just the market of government, it's a barometer of what others will use. So, and it's global. So I think that the competitors in this space will do their best to conform to putting out the best product. And I think they're also, because of the transparency, if they don't, they'll be exposed. So there's a reputational issue also to contend with. So, I'm really gung ho on this, quality improvement aspect of executive order.
Great. We have amazing questions coming on YouTube. So people that are listening, please add questions. We're more than happy to address them later on. Dimitri, I have a question to you. Since you're starting Savage and you breathing IoT, NOT for I don't know how many last years, how will this change the IoT vendor, and what is the order will mean? And not just from the SBOM perspective, just in general.
Right. It's going to be, first of all, it's going to be challenging for sure for everyone. And this executive order, the way I see it, it's really a true wake-up call for the public and the private sectors. Many companies doing their business by white labeling other companies' products, and based on this executive order, they either will need their supply chain to line up with it, or there will be serious impact of their business, right? And in some cases, actually in many cases, the thing that they will have to change and adapt is actually their process, or their internal organizational process of how they do things, because there is no technology or silver bullet that can solve this problem, right? They will have to find the right technology to help them through the type of transformations, but I don't think there is something that they can just go and flip a switch and be compliant with the requirements of this order, because it's so broad. It requires so many things, as you mentioned. It's not just around SBOMs or transparency of the software, right? It talks about many other things like EDR and the ability to disclosure a breach. I think this morning I read it's going to be like requirement of disclosing a breach in 24 hours from the moment it happened, which is quite challenging. And as we mentioned, right, because of all of these procurement requirements, the companies will have to embrace very truly the concept of secure by design for whatever they're building.
Can you explain more what does it mean from IoT space? Like, how do I design a VCR or a medical device with security in mind?
That's a great question. So let's think about even the basic levels of where we're going to source our parts from, right? Where is the chip manufactured? Who written the chip operating system, or the code that's running inside the chip? Or as example, when you designing an IoT device, where are you placing your bus and data layers on the PCB, right? On the electronic board. You don't want to put them on the surface layers of the PCB. You want to bury them inside, so they're hard to get to. And whoever tries to attack or reverse engineer your solution, he needs to go through some layers. Like it's at that level, right? So that's what secure by design is. And then it goes, of course, to the software and what kind of software you're using, what kind of open sources you are using, how you building, how you coding, are you following some standards on the market when you're coding it, what kind of tools and frameworks you're using, do you have the proper policies in the company to to track and immediately get information about new vulnerabilities affecting your software, right? Do you have ability to get information, like send telemetry from the devices, right, from IoT devices, and understand what happened to these devices? Do you have ability, what happens if some malicious code gets into the devices, right, and compromise the device? What you're doing, is it like game over for your company, or you still have some measures or something you can do? Like, I'm participating in a lot of research that we are doing as part of being an IoT security company. And what we are seeing, and that's interesting, is that every single public IP in North America been attacked between 3,000 to 22,000 times a day, right? It's a scary numbers by hundreds of malicious IPs. Right, and this is something that we're recording, we're researching, we're doing a lot of research around that internally. But that's kind of scary statistics, frankly saying. And this is also why there is a motivation to include this type of solutions under the executive order. Well, there is a lot of discussions already that I can see in the industry happening about hardware security capabilities, right? Things like secure boots and trusted execution enclaves for code. However, these measures, they mostly protect against secondary wave of attacks, right? The ones where attacker already landed on your system and he tries kind of to get to the root of the things. Right, he already has this privileged access, and now he tries to extract some type of identification or encrypted data. But what protects the devices, as example, right, against these threat actors landing their malicious code on the devices? And that's also something that will have to change, right? The level of ability to monitor, right, have like endpoint detection, protection, and response capabilities for every single thing that's connected to the internet or to the public world. So that's what these companies and these vendors will have to think and consider about, in my opinion.
Right. I love IoT/OT in this context. We use that all the time, right? But but it frames this conversation. OT, to be clear, operational technology. This is critical infrastructure: ships, boats, planes, rail. The big stuff. IoT is your $17 camera and all this little stuff, right? And we're talking about it all at the same time. And OT gives us good examples of how we get through this. Because it turns out if you build national power grids and so forth, they will actually kill people. In fact, all these massive systems that have been around for decades and centuries, in some cases thousands of years, work very well, but imperfectly, and that's okay. I love boats, and the perfectly good boat sinks all the time, but you do what you can. So we're going to have $17 cameras and so forth. That will continue. So if the solution seems to be that every IoT vendor out there suddenly has to do things that will cost more than the GDP of a small nation, that's not going to be the way it works out. You can see the indications of some ways it works out. And again, present company, there are companies motivated to sell things to IoT manufacturers that help them shorten this, give them the telemetry, like a Sybase thing or whatever. There's always going to be the motivations for people to help the IoT vendors get good enough, because the solution is not going to be, and going from, again, that perfect frame, OT, we tend to think of capital S as we put it in place for decades. IoT, we think about things we literally may only use once and throw away. But the framing of the whole thing ends up with many of the same solutions. Is the same visibility we need into software bill of materials, into the contents, into the function and operation. And we're not going to count on the individual device being absolutely perfect. It's going to be part of a system of attestations, of content, of state, of threat intelligence, so that each piece works together well enough. So every time we find ourselves going down the IoT path and imagining IoT vendors going to do things that are too onerous, we have to diverge from that, because they will do what they're capable of.
Yeah, let me add to that. I think you hit the really big word in all of this is visibility. And I think for any IoT vendor, the first step, and that's also pushed by the NIST framework, that is know what's in your system, your software, your hardware, have an inventory. So I think before you do anything, before you connect, before you create a business in a network, you have to know what's in your system, whether it be the software, the hardware, whether your default passwords have been changed, and what you're connected to. So I think it all starts with that, and it's really a bigger issue with cybersecurity. I mean, now we're going to be in a world where there are going to be 3 times as many connected devices as people. I think we have to have accountability to who's using what devices and how, and what kind of security they have on those devices before we let them into our network.
You guys mentioned many different OT and IoT devices, from boats to planes to refrigerators and many like electrical grid devices. What do you think right now is the most vulnerable one out there?
All of the above.
All of the above.
Yeah.
Do you want to elaborate a bit more?
Well, it's gotten to, it's a target-rich environment, right? So on the one hand, nation states have not been going to war with each other because, you don't launch cyber attacks against infrastructure unless you're also going to launch missiles. But we're getting to the edge of that. The Colonial Pipeline attack is, one of these, I'm not saying, I'm just saying, plausibly deniable, not really a nation attacking another one, but that's flirting right up against the edge. Now, can you do that with agriculture? Can you do that in the healthcare system? Can you do that with shipping, rail? Research shows that you can't. So it's less about which is more vulnerable to, what are our responses should someone do something like that while we're in the process of making it so people can't do those things.
We had DDoS attacks from DVRs a long time ago. Like we're talking about 4 or 5 years. So people are upset, but I guess people are getting more and more upset because of the implication of what may happen on a nation level.
Right. Yeah. All of us who worked on national plans and so forth here in the U.S. and elsewhere know this. I mean, all of this escalates to the point where you can shut down countries, and shutting, in Paul F. Roberts' Forbes piece, he talks about a denial of sustenance attack. And turns out that's not new. Denying sustenance to your opponent, is something that goes back thousands of years. Now, in any sort of modern conflict, would hacking the food supply system of a nation be part of an active conflict? I don't see why not. Right? So we're, again, these executive orders from countries like the United States don't happen in a vacuum, particularly not series of them that line up. We were edging towards international realms where countries need to be very thoughtful about both, how they defend themselves and what their responses are to these things.
I have a feeling that majority of the companies will try to provide the SBOM privately and not publicly, because they will be concerned, I think Dimitri mentioned this part, that other people, like competitors, will see how they build the code, or potentially they know using an open source code, they may try to influence or change the other code to impact or get into the company.
So this speaks again to the multiple sources of validation. So having a software bill of materials from somewhere is great. It's a good start. Maybe get one from another source so you know what's inside things. Watch things as they're running in operations. The sharing of information. Watch your. We're going through a global pandemic now. The analogies are not lost on those of us who think about cybersecurity, but be careful who you're touching. What are your relationships? What's your contract language? How do you know you're dealing with reputable sources today? Do those things better. So, but as I've said, I think software bill of materials particularly won't always be as shared and as public as the first blush thinks. What I think we'll tend to see is software bill of materials and similar attestations about IP will be conditionally shared based on contract language and agreement.
Great.
I'd like to add into the most vulnerable system networks, because I think we had a case study this year with all the attacks on our healthcare under COVID-19. They were rampant, phishing attacks, ransomware attacks up almost 300%. And there's a reason for that, because that industry, first of all, did not invest in security. They're operating with a lot of disparate networks and devices, particularly IoT devices, medical devices and networks of doctors and nurses and patients. So they're easy pickings, particularly for criminal hackers. And now that they can get paid through cryptocurrency and extort, it became a hot item. And so I think, if we look at that industry and look at the case studies of what happened and why, we can bolster, future elements, particularly with other industries. And also, the thing worries me most, I think, still is the grid. It's still built. Most of it was built in the 70s. It is another area where there's a lot of opportunity with legacy systems and vulnerabilities, and the implications if something did happen in a serious critical infrastructure attack. I think we'd be paying a very serious price.
Yeah, I also want to add something to it, and I think that probably the grids and the water treatment facilities, which are in the headlines these days, they're the most vulnerable systems out there. Of course, we cannot survive, we cannot keep our day-to-day without the system up and running 24/7. One of the issues there is the window of exposure. When there is a vulnerability or exploited vulnerability in the field, it's very hard to take these systems down and patch them, even if you want it, right? Because these systems have to run and provide services like 24/7, and if someone shuts them down, then either lives will be at risk or we all going to feel it, right? And we have seen it as part of the Colonial Pipeline attack. So that's probably the first to protect, right? And that's part of the critical infrastructure systems. The other ones are, as Chuck and Chris mentioned, they're medical devices, for sure. Many of these devices, they're operating non-supported operating systems, right? So they're running like on Windows 7 and Windows XP that are out of support completely. And that's one of the examples where SBOM can help, because when I'm buying a device, and if I'm buying, let's say, a CT scan machine for a hospital, and this CT scan machine is running on Windows XP or Windows 7, once I get this information, usually I will receive a warranty and service agreement from the vendor of these devices. However, I would be able to question and say, hey, how are you going to support this machine from cybersecurity perspective or other perspectives that's related to operating system if this operating system is already end of life and not supported anymore? So all of this transparency that will be brought, that's definitely very welcome.
Great. We have many questions coming from the audience, so let's bring some of them. Chuck, you mentioned about CMMC. So we have a questions from Peter about CMMC, and if you guys think it will go to the rest of the government as well.
I do. I mean, already Department of Homeland Security said they're going to use those same requirements. It's still in process, and they're still determining what's going to be used and what's not going to be used, and it's in test case. So there are a few companies now doing it in actual projects. But I think the way the government works, it's split into the security DoD IC area and then the civilian, which is led by DHS. And once DHS leads the civilian, I think they're going to probably require the other agencies, which they're responsible for monitoring security, to implement the CMMC too.
Agreed.
So another question coming from Guy. So if a vendor wants to comply with the executive order, what should be their first steps? And I guess it could be in any cases. It could be EDR, vulnerability management, microsegmentation, multi-factor authentication. So we may have different answers here.
Well, you think about there's a lot going on here, but I'm thinking about all this in the software bill of material context. So if you're a vendor and you don't know what SBOMs are, now's the time to educate yourself. If you do what they are, then now's the time to put a plan in place. I've been working with a number of vendors, large and small. Some of the biggest vendors out there, have been working for the last 12 to 18 months on putting an SBOM plan in place. So my recommendation is display diligence. Read the actual EO, look at what is requiring of you and downstream and upstream of you, and start thinking through the steps to create and consume SBOMs, and the relationships, the contract language, specifically the policies between you and other supply chain actors to support those.
I would also add that it would be great to look into automation, right, and try to identify if all your processes are automated and they are error prone, human error, or anyone that could interfere in this process, and start developing metrics around these processes. There's also a good point of following some industry standards, right? And then you need to identify the one that's relevant for your specific market, right? So if you are a medical device building medical devices, then you probably want to follow the FDA regulation for the pre-market, for the post-market, and the submission, etc. If you are in critical infrastructure, then you have, if you in North America, you have the NERC SIP. If you are in Europe, you have the IC 62443. So definitely identify the right thing for you and follow the best practices. Once you understand of course, before even getting there, I would say that, before even getting to doing something about it, first of all, identify your gaps, right? So make the proper assessment, understand where you are today, what are the gaps that you want to breach over, and then start looking for solutions, or, which might be internal or external solutions to your organization.
Great. So here's an interesting question that I think is very, very relevant to SBOM. As we all know, when you contract a person to create a software for you, you don't really know who they have, who they outsource, and the person who they outsource, it could be like a chain of people that wrote something. And it could be a very interesting discussion, like if this can be addressed with SBOM, would it be addressed with SBOM, or it need to be addressed in a different way?
Right. So I'll state my bias on this. So I've been thinking nodes and channels and attestation ecosystems 24 hours a day for 2 years. And this to me is a DBOM question. And this again comes back to those relationships. If I'm buying something from you, and think about this for a second, if we take SBOM to mean that everybody who ever gets or uses or sells a piece of software is going to provide the SBOM with it. Could you just imagine, I don't think most organizations have the disk space to store the SBOMs related to all the software they have. So it's not about everybody telling everybody everything all the bloody time. It's about saying that if I'm going to buy this from you, then I trust you, I'm fine. And if something, under these conditions, I will want more. There's a great use case we did in the DBOM consortium on a following a metal bracket, through its manufacturing into use into failure, and what happens right now. And what happens now is, the metal bracket's holding a camera over a highway, it falls and kills somebody. And over the course of 12 to 24 months, all sorts of people produce all sorts of records in court. And we can solve that by setting up smart contracts and attestation channels so that when this, if it fails, you will provide the information about this one thing immediately and automate that, right? So that it happens right away. There is no 24 months of lawsuits. You don't have cartons of data and files being produced in court all the bloody time. You agree in advance, here's the relationship. Should, what we agreed, happen or not happen, whatever the relationship you can put together up your chain, that's when you get that visibility. So to the Isabella, to your question, at that fine point, and this is where I get really excited, because the basic infrastructure of SBOMs and nodes and channels and attestations, to me has gotten really pedantic and boring. It's how we work with it, how we get into the edges. It'll be fascinating to see how this works out, but I think it can be done.
Dimitri, Chuck?
Well, I think it's exactly right. I think maybe that also is going to probably be more important now than it was in the past is the automation of software testing, for code problems. So the behavioral aspects of it too. A lot of the algorithms being developed now with machine learning and artificial intelligence could impact on that area. And again, it goes into the visibility issue of what's in your network, what's in your code, what's in your system. And I think that if it comes down to a security first perspective, and so I'm excited to see it go in this direction.
Thank you, Isabella. We have a question from Mene. It's an interesting one. So yes, government trying to have more transparency. And I guess the ultimate questions, how much is enough?
Right. And, and this is one of the ancient questions, the perennial questions, right? We joke about this a lot, in cybersecurity, but It's true enough. Assume the adversary already has all this information. They tend to, right? And they may not necessarily be true in every case, literally of every piece of information, but unless they don't, they probably do. And it's better to assume that way. So the security through obscurity, while it does have some uses, it's a funny world, isn't that great a plan. And empirically, it's just not working out really well for us. So having transparency, and as I keep reiterating here, I don't think that we're on an inevitability curve. Things are going to happen, and they include that there will be transparency provided, and that not everybody's going to provide transparency to everybody else all the time, right? So it's we're walking down a step.
Yeah, I think that the first thing with the transparency that everyone will benefit from is transparency to yourself. That's organization, right?
Do right? Yeah.
Exactly. You will discover and unveil a lot of things that you'll figure out. Oh, wow, that's how we do it today. Or maybe we need to improve a couple of things, right? So that's already will accelerate, right, the improvement of your software, of your solutions, right? You'll build more resilient things, more resilient products as a result of it. And then if you will embrace it, right, then it would be very easy to be transparent here, right? Like, just be transparent completely, and you would be kind of future proof with whatever you're building and whatever your product is.
Great. I have another question, then I think we can reference it in a bit different. How the executive orders that right now is focusing on the government, but probably in 6 months, a year, will go to financial sectors, to the banks. What do you think they need to do, or how they should start thinking about this, how to adopt it as well?
So I think talking to your peers is a really good place to start. A number of the big financials, I'd be happy to connect you. Most have been talking in public about this, but we'll save names for the moment, have been going down this path. So as you know, many large banks have enormous software bases of their own. Some of the big banks have more programmers than Microsoft. So and you see down this diligence path in the financial space, people working on the attestations about the CI/CD pipelines inside their company. Do we know, to Dimitri's point, do we know ourselves? Do we know who is touching our own code and internally and where it's coming from and whatnot? That's a very good diligence path. Will be supported by others in the industry. And the come again to contract language. Look at the regulations, look at the structures that you're regulated by, you're controlled by, and look to the questions you're asking of those who supply you things. Are you saying to them that if you're going to provide me systems, you will let me know what's inside them? Will you provide SBOMs? And lastly, a number of issues here, but work out ways to consume those. This information coming in from vendors, what do you do with that when that gets inside? And there's developing fields and folks like these who can help you with that.
Yeah, I agree. I think that one of the things that the executive order is a two-way street, and the financial industry has really been ahead of the game compared to most others, particularly government, and particularly in state and local government. So they've already invested heavily in these areas, and there's lessons to be learned. There's been a reluctance to share outside of their industry, and I think one of the things that the executive order will do, it'll bring disparate industries together to share what tools are working, how you have better visibility into your products, and also the training and threat intelligence, particularly. Threat intelligence is really one of the areas where I think the financial community excels because they have to know who's trying to steal their money and getting into their accounts. So they've done hired a lot of good people out of the intelligence community, out of FBI, other agencies, and I think they're a good pathway to look for in terms of this executive order.
Zero Trust and ZTNA, and in general, was mentioned multiple times in the executive order. And I think it's like one of these magical acronyms that people use a lot lately. In your perspective, how it will evolve? And I also want to hear maybe how it evolve in OT and IoT space.
So I'll pull up the Wayback Machine, right? This is firewall question 101. Is it allow by default or deny by default? Am I specifically, saying I like you, don't know you, or am I saying I kind of like everybody and I'm not sure who I don't like? So zero trust is just another way to say those same things. That you don't start by trusting anything in particular, but you build that trust out. So in this context, things like it's come up a number of times in this conversation, and does in every one of these every conversation like that this these days. How do I know that the SBOM somebody's sending me is real? Well, do I know who I'm buying my software from? Do I have do I know that they're financially viable? They've been around for a while. Do I know anything about them? If not, then I probably have procurement issues as well. So at the zero, each of these acronyms and names and tags we give to things quite often turns into things, and zero trust architectures and products everybody's got them these days may work in a lot of wonderful ways, but I think it's a perfect example in this space. And I'll end with I've touched on a couple of things. The Global Semiconductor Alliance has an IP working group, public activity going on right now. Is a perfect example of this, where the chip vendors themselves have come to realize they are sharing information already, like Chuck pointed about the banks, and they're going to do more, and they're going to do SBOMs and so forth. So there's no trust exercise like working with your competitors to see if your trust models are good.
Actually, Evgeny, I think that it would be interesting to turn the table around and maybe hear your opinion on this question.
Okay. Since we are all working from home, not all, but majority of us working from home for the last almost 18 months, unfortunately, and basically the way we need to authenticate ourselves or create rules is relying a lot on who we are, or maybe from where we're coming, like the device itself and not the IP. I feel personally that we will have more IAM, identity access management, place in zero trust. Who you are, from where you're coming, what if the device is compliant. And we will create a lot of the rules using zero trust like this. If I want to connect back to our infrastructure or my data center, I will want to check who you are, multi-factor authentication, and potentially check from what kind of device you're coming, if it's a compliant device or not compliant device. By compliant, I mean if it's a part of Active Directory, it's a part of domain, or it has an MDM installed. Or if I'm going to the internet, I may provide you access to browse based on from where you're coming as well. So I think we will have much more identity base of zero trust, and slowly, actually kind of there, but not fully on the behavior part, depend on what I do and how I do it in the internet, my zero trust rules may change. So if Evgeny, even so fully authenticated, downloading too many files in irregular hours, it may kick in something that will change how I can connect or what I can do. Okay, we have more questions here, and some of them very, very good, guys. Thank you very much for the questions and the interaction. Kirk, you ask an interesting questions about infrastructure as a service. So we have the three giants, AWS, GCP, and Azure, and they do quite a lot. And the question, I guess, here, would they provide SBOM as well?
The short answer is yes. So they'll have to decide whether they want to sell it all into those. We're here talking about executive orders, so we're doing regulated industries. So if you as an integrator or a solution provider are using somebody else's stuff and they don't want to provide SBOMs that are required, they've just decided not to be in that market. So they will provide them.
I want to add something to this, is that the SBOM itself, it also has a depth, right? So it depends how deep you're going and what is the depth of the SBOM that you require. Because when you get to some point, for example, with AWS, as you mentioned, there is different type of certification that they are going through, right? And you have different type of trust. And there's like basic principle components that being used in your design. So, for example, like if you're using Greengrass or using DynamoDB or you're using a Lambda execution or Lambda runtime environment in your design, that's again, that could be your kind of lower level providing when you're describing your service. So eventually, to your customers, you're selling them a SaaS service. However, there is underlying building blocks for the service, which would be part of your code, part of libraries you have used. However, there will also be infrastructure related or infrastructure as a code related components there as well as SBOM. And again, it depends how deep you want to dive as part of your SBOM description and as part of how well you know the description language, which today is usually either CycloneDX or SPDX.
Because there are only 3 of them, I'm wondering if they say we don't want to provide it. Like in the beginning of AWS, they didn't want to change any contracts. They didn't want to kind of play ball with the big companies. Would they be able to force themselves because people have so much infrastructure already there?
Well, right. This touches on some of my earlier comments. I believe I see very clearly what's going to happen in the short term here. What interests me is that slightly longer term. So what's going to happen in the short term are things like this. I haven't seen it yet, and frankly, in the big players, I think they're all sort of lining up down this path, anyways. But we'll have situations where somebody says, "Okay, you give me these SBOMs," and someone else is going to say, "Now, no," and have a good point, right? And that's when we get into the back and forth and say, "All right, I can understand that, but you have to agree that if the U.S. CERT comes out with a vulnerability that says, gosh, that might be you, and you're in me, there's going to come a point. I'm gonna get access to that information." As you just said, Dimitri, that's the next step. And I'll tell you the state of evolution. Only this month have I had multiple people in different conversations bring up the issue of partial SBOMs. Because yes, when it comes time to share that, it may be that all you really get access to is part of that individual document, that individual SBOM. Perfectly reasonable. But we're just starting to work through these things. So we'll see these back, and we'll see in the media headlines and saying, company pushes back. But that's just an artifact of this, big negotiation we're all going through.
Thank you. So we have questions from Gary. If I already purchased a software and I've been using the software for a long time, do I retroactively go and asking for SBOM from the vendor? Do I ask it for I need to renew the license or buy more hardware?
Again, sort of all of the above. This gets talked about an awful lot. I think there will be ecosystems of folks, developing SBOMs for existing stuff. And you mentioned software and hardware as well. So there's a lot of bombs flying around. We're all talking about software bill of materials right now. It's good to get that when solid in our heads. Just imagine it's a document, it's a Word document, whatever it is. It's saying in this software are these things. Now, a hardware bill of materials is talking about the hardware. And then you have things like in toto. The question from the banks, in toto is about the custody of software. So we have all these different attestations about things, and but an existing installation of a piece of hardware with software on it has a history and people who touched it and did things to it. So something as simple as just an SBOM that may or may not represent what was originally on that system 7 years ago is interesting, but it's not the whole thing. So no, you're not going to have to run and get one because that's not the solution by itself.
Thank you. Guys, thank you for all the good questions. I think we are done with the questions. Let's just double quickly check. Yep. Thank you everybody for joining today for the State of Cybersecurity Industry panel. It was amazing to have you guys here as a panelist and amazing questions from the audience as well. Please remember to subscribe, and we're going to have many, many more panelists and questions like this, and I guess more interaction with the people. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, folks.